The world was burning. Cities turned to ash, nations torn apart, and millions left with nothing but despair. But behind the front lines, another war raged, a war for wealth, art, and the very soul of Europe. The Nazis were not just conquerors of land. They were thieves of history. From golden bars torn from central banks to priceless paintings stripped from Jewish families, Hitler's regime amassed one of the greatest plunders in human history. But as the tide of war turned, this treasure, hidden in convoys, trains, and secret vaults, became both a weapon and a curse. The Allies knew that finding these convoys was more than a matter of money. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming stolen culture. It was about cutting off the Nazi war machine before it could rise again. Tonight, we uncover the hidden files, the forgotten missions, and the razor's-edge decisions that determined whether Europe's stolen future would be lost forever or found. This is not just history. It is a chase, a betrayal, and a reckoning. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Every week, we bring you untold war stories, raw, immersive, and unfiltered, so you can walk through the shadows of history as if you were there. Now, let's enter the world of secret convoys and whispered intelligence, the story of how the Allies tracked the Nazi treasure convoys. The story of the Nazi treasure convoys cannot be told without first stepping into the vaults they emptied. From the earliest days of Hitler's rise, the plunder of wealth was not just incidental to conquest. It was policy, carefully engineered to finance war, intimidate nations, and erase entire cultures from existence. In March 1938, when German troops marched into Austria in the infamous Anschluss, the theft began almost immediately. Within days, the Austrian National Bank was stripped of nearly 100 tons of gold reserves. Uniformed men, working with chilling efficiency, loaded ingots into crates and shipped them straight to Berlin. What had taken generations for Austria to accumulate vanished overnight, destined to fuel the Nazi war machine. But the looting did not stop with banks. Jewish families, targeted with ruthless precision, were forced to sign away businesses, land, and heirlooms. The Gestapo's ledger books read like death sentences. Rothschild estates broken apart, libraries seized, entire collections of art inventoried before being whisked away. In Vienna alone, over 6,000 works of art were confiscated in a matter of weeks. The Nazis weren't simply thieves, they were rewriting ownership of culture itself, declaring masterpieces of Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Klimt as property of the Reich. As war expanded, so did the scale of plunder. When France fell in June 1940, Hitler stood at the Louvre, surveying halls of Europe's most precious works. Though some curators had hidden paintings in countryside chateaux, the Nazi looting squads, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, were relentless. Trains left Paris in the dead of night, their cargo not soldiers, but sculptures, manuscripts, and paintings destined for secret depots in Germany. Entire convoys rolled out of Belgium, Holland, Poland, and beyond, each one carrying fragments of history stolen under armed guard. The greed was systematic. Each conquered nation was stripped bare. Gold reserves were the priority, followed by industrial assets, and finally the treasures of culture. Nothing was too small. Candlesticks melted into bullion, church bells recast as weapons, Torah scrolls locked away or destroyed. What the Nazis could not use, they erased. But behind the scale of this theft lay something darker, a vision of permanence. Hitler dreamed of building the Führer Museum in Linz, Austria, a sprawling temple to art and power that would dwarf the world's greatest museums. For that dream, convoys carried stolen paintings under camouflage tarps and in armored trains, protected as though they were military divisions. The Reich's stolen wealth was not only about war, it was about legacy, and yet with every theft, resistance quietly grew. Bank clerks secretly recorded missing gold bars. Museum curators risked their lives to keep shadow inventories, jotting down every work that vanished into Nazi hands. And deep inside London and Washington, analysts were beginning to notice unusual movements of wealth, strange transfers. Sudden disappearances of entire vaults, coded shipments that did not match troop deployments. By 1942, the Allies realized the theft was more than cultural vandalism. These convoys were lifelines of the Reich, feeding both propaganda and production. To stop them meant more than justice. It meant weakening the enemy's very foundations. But the challenge was staggering. The treasure convoys were ghosts, guarded by secrecy, moving under cover of darkness and deception. Identifying them would require not just military strength, but spies, double agents, and codebreakers willing to gamble with lives for clues. The hunt had begun, and as Allied intelligence pieced together the first fragments of the puzzle, they uncovered whispers of movement so vast, so audacious, that it forced a chilling question. If Hitler's treasure convoys could not be stopped, would the Reich's stolen wealth outlast the war itself? Every war is fought with steel and fire, but it is also fought in silence, in the pauses between radio transmissions, in the coded scribbles of double agents, in the whispers exchanged in dimly lit cafes. The Allied hunt for Nazi treasure convoys began not with a dramatic ambush on a mountain road, but with fragments of gossip, half-truths, and intelligence reports so fragile they could collapse under the weight of a single error. By late 1941, the pattern of Nazi looting was no longer a mystery. What the Allies needed was to know where the stolen wealth was going. The convoys, often disguised as ordinary military transports, blended into the chaos of wartime Europe. Yet small details betrayed them. Trains that traveled with too many guards for their supposed cargo, convoys rerouted at night through remote valleys, or shipments that coincided not with troop movements, but with the fall of a bank vault or museum. The first whispers came from occupied France. Members of the Resistance, risking death by firing squad, reported strange trucks leaving Paris at midnight, escorted by SS men who seemed more concerned with their cargo than their route. One resistance fighter, a former railway worker, noted the absence of standard military supplies. No crates of ammunition, no barrels of fuel. Instead, heavy wooden chests, sealed, branded with Reich symbols, and handled with a reverence that suggested far greater value than weapons. Simultaneously, in neutral Switzerland, bankers noticed sudden, unexplained deposits of gold, bars stamped with marks from Poland, Austria, and the Netherlands. These deposits, moved through secret channels, hinted that the Reich was laundering its loot to finance its war economy. Some Swiss bankers quietly tipped off British contacts, feeding the growing suspicion that treasure convoys were not simply relocating art and wealth within Germany, but funneling plunder into international markets to sustain the Nazi machine. In Lisbon, Portugal, a hotbed of espionage during the war, agents from Britain's MI6 mingled with German operatives, black market dealers, and double agents. In smoky bars along the waterfront, whispers of ghost convoys spread among smugglers. One rumor claimed entire trains vanished into the Austrian Alps, never to re-emerge. Another spoke of trucks winding through Italy, bound not for the front, but for secluded monasteries, where priests were coerced into hiding treasure under the threat of reprisal. But rumors alone were not enough. The Allies needed confirmation. That came from a different source, intercepted letters and coded transmissions. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency, began working with Britain's codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Among messages detailing troop maneuvers and supply chains, cryptanalysts discovered irregular phrases, shipments referred to as iron harvest, special consignments, or cultural transports. The language was vague, deliberately so, but analysts began to suspect that these phrases masked the movements of plundered wealth. Still, the greatest breakthroughs came from human courage. A small network of informants in Berlin itself, many of them working-class Germans who despised the regime, relayed details of trains leaving the Reichsbank under mysterious circumstances. One night in 1942, An informant described a train loaded not with coal or munitions, but with crates so heavy that teams of men struggled to lift them. When asked where the train was headed, an SS officer muttered only one word: Salzburg. Piece by piece, a shadow map began to form. Certain routes were used repeatedly. Convoys moved east to west, north to south, always with an obsessive secrecy that made them stand out from ordinary troop logistics. It was as if the Nazis themselves knew these shipments were vulnerable, that exposure would risk not only the cargo, but the very legitimacy of their regime. And yet, even as the Allies closed in, there remained one haunting problem. To intercept a convoy meant knowing exactly where and when it would appear. To strike too soon risked missing the treasure. To strike too late meant losing it forever. The Allies had the whispers, the rumors, and the fragments. What they lacked was precision. That would change when the silence was finally broken, not by spies in smoky rooms, but by the unseen voices carried across radio waves. Wars are often decided not by generals in the field, but by the men and women listening to static, pulling secrets out of the ether. For the Allies, the hunt for Nazi treasure convoys turned decisively when whispers in the shadows became signals in the air. Radio waves, the lifeblood of German command and control, carried the keys to one of the greatest thefts in human history. At Bletchley Park, the sprawling English estate turned code-breaking hub. Hundreds of cryptanalysts pored over intercepted German messages. The famed Enigma machine had already been cracked, but victory did not mean every message was clear. Codes were constantly updated, ciphers made more complex. Still, the patience of the code breakers, many of them young mathematicians, linguists, and chess players, was relentless. Each night, lines of teletype printouts revealed fragments of conversations, logistics requests, shipment confirmations, and administrative chatter from the Reich. Amid reports of ammunition shortages and troop rotations, a peculiar pattern emerged. Repeated references to Sondertransport, special transports. To a casual eye, they could have been anything. But context was everything. The transports were guarded not by Wehrmacht supply divisions, but by SS units. Their routes often bypassed strategic supply depots, traveling instead through regions known for mines, castles, or secluded alpine roads. And above all, their scheduling was erratic, moving at night, stopping in isolated sidings, waiting hours before resuming. It was Alan Turing himself who remarked during a debriefing, "This isn't logistics, it's choreography." The convoys, he argued, were designed not for efficiency but secrecy. Someone, somewhere, was hiding something worth far more than tanks or fuel. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, precursor to the NSA, intercepted communications passing through neutral Spain and Portugal. Within these coded bursts were references to banking transactions, gold weights, and consignments listed under vague labels like industrial reserves. When decrypted, they pointed to a staggering truth: looted gold was being funneled through Iberian ports, exchanged for tungsten and other strategic materials Germany desperately needed. The convoys, it seemed, were not only moving treasure for safekeeping, but serving as arteries for the Reich's economic survival. But the breakthrough came from a fusion of sources. Resistance fighters in occupied Belgium had noted a heavily guarded train leaving Brussels under cover of darkness. Bletchley's decrypts mentioned a special cargo passing through Aachen that same night. OSS agents in Lisbon reported a surge of Nazi gold moving through clandestine Swiss accounts. 3 different signals in 3 different countries, all aligning on the same convoy. For the first time, Allied command realized the treasure convoys could be tracked in real time. But that knowledge raised impossible questions. Should they strike them directly, risking the destruction of priceless cultural artifacts? Or should they shadow them silently, gathering intelligence for a larger net that might one day reclaim it all? The debate reached the highest levels. In London, Winston Churchill himself reportedly asked whether seizing the convoys would be worth diverting aircraft from the bombing of industrial centres. In Washington, Roosevelt's advisors warned that treasure might mean little compared to steel and fuel. Yet others argued fiercely. Reclaiming Europe's stolen heritage was more than symbolic. It was a blow to the Reich's legitimacy, a signal to occupied nations that their culture would not be erased. In the end, a compromise emerged. The Allies would watch, record, and wait. Each intercepted transmission, each informant's report, became a tile in a mosaic of treasure routes stretching from Paris to Salzburg, from Warsaw to the Alps. The Allies would not pounce prematurely. They would let the net tighten, but even as Allied intelligence gained clarity, the Nazis grew wary. Convoys began traveling under heavier guard, their codes shifting more frequently. And then, one night in 1943, an intercepted signal suggested a convoy was carrying something greater than art or gold, something that could alter the balance of the war itself. The Allies faced a chilling decision. The night was their shield. The Nazis knew that their treasure convoys could not withstand open scrutiny, so they wrapped them in darkness, deception, and fear. Every shipment was a gamble, and every route a carefully plotted riddle. For the Allies, the chase had become a deadly game of anticipation, because once the convoys rolled, the window to intercept them closed fast. Most began in occupied capitals, where bank vaults and museums were systematically emptied. Gold bars were stacked like bricks, packed into heavy wooden crates. Paintings were slipped into specially built containers, their canvases insulated against vibration. Sculptures were encased in straw and hay, carried like livestock in sealed wagons. Then came the guards, SS officers, heavily armed, who rode the convoys not as escorts but as wardens, prepared to shoot anyone, including their own men, if secrecy was breached. To the untrained eye, a treasure convoy could look like any other transport. Trucks were painted with military insignia. Trains were coupled with flatbeds carrying ordinary supplies. Even ambulances were sometimes added to mislead aerial reconnaissance. Convoys often traveled just behind legitimate troop movements, blending into the chaos of the front. And yet, there were tells, the obsessive guarding, the sudden detours, the absence of standard rations or munitions. These were the details Allied intelligence had trained itself to spot. The routes themselves were treacherous. Across France, convoys wound through rural lanes and forest tracks, avoiding main highways where partisans might strike. In Belgium, armored trains slid through night stations, pausing only long enough for guards to sweep platforms with flashlights and dogs. In the east, Poland's railways carried convoys past burned-out villages. The stolen treasures of a murdered people packed into wagons that rattled through the night toward German strongholds. But the most notorious routes were those into the Alps. There, in Austria and southern Germany, the Nazis built hidden vaults in salt mines, tunnels, and mountain fortresses. The Altersee salt mine, vast enough to swallow cathedrals, became one of the Reich's most secretive depositories. Convoys winding into these mountains were all but invisible, disappearing into narrow passes where Allied bombers could not follow. Intercepting them was perilous. Resistance groups tried ambushes, sometimes succeeding in capturing small caches, but often at horrific cost. In 1943, near Lyon, French partisans stopped what they believed was an ammunition convoy. Instead, they found crates of silver chalices and reliquaries stripped from churches. Before they could spirit the loot away, a German counterattack killed most of the unit. The treasure was reclaimed, the survivors executed publicly as a warning. Still, the Allies pressed closer. They used aerial reconnaissance to map rail movements, tracing which trains vanished into mountain tunnels. They charted truck convoys that made inexplicable detours to remote monasteries or abandoned castles. OSS agents infiltrated border towns, bribing station masters and truck drivers to talk. Every new piece of data brought them closer to understanding the convoy system. And then came the most chilling revelation. Some convoys were not merely moving gold and art, but wealth melted down from the victims of the Holocaust. Bars stamped with Reich, Marks had their origins not in banks, but in concentration camps, where the gold teeth and jewelry of the murdered were confiscated and smelted. These convoys carried not just treasure, but evidence of atrocity. To intercept them was not simply about reclaiming wealth, it was about exposing crimes on an industrial scale. By late 1943, the Allies had drawn a clearer map of the Nazi treasure arteries. Yet every attempt to close in seemed to end in disaster. Trains rerouted at the last moment, convoys vanishing into mountain roads, informants betrayed before they could deliver their final message. It was becoming clear the treasure convoys were more than supply lines. They were shadows, moving targets designed to frustrate and evade. And somewhere within those shadows, betrayal was at work. The war for treasure was not only fought on roads and railways, it was waged in the murky underworld of espionage, where loyalty was a currency more volatile than gold. The Allies' pursuit of Nazi convoys was closing in, but with every step forward came sabotage, leaks, and the unmistakable stench of betrayal. From the start, the intelligence web was perilously fragile. Resistance fighters risked everything to pass information across borders, often carrying coded notes tucked into shoe soles or memorized under false identities. But the Gestapo was relentless. Networks were infiltrated, couriers arrested, and information twisted until no one knew what was true. In 1943, a French operative codenamed Marcel provided details of a train leaving Paris under heavy guard, claiming it carried crates marked for Hitler's personal museum. Allied bombers prepared an ambush on a rural section of track, but when the attack came, the wagons were filled with civilians deported to labor camps. The ambush became a massacre, not of treasure but of innocence. In London, questions were raised. Had Marcel been turned? Or had the Nazis deliberately fed false intelligence, sacrificing civilians to discredit Allied efforts? Double agents were everywhere. In neutral Lisbon, the OSS cultivated smugglers and bankers for leads on Reich gold shipments. But among them lurked German operatives, selling fabricated details in exchange for Allied funds. Every false lead sent resources chasing shadows, while the true convoys slipped deeper into the Alps. Trust was the most dangerous gamble of all, yet betrayal cut both ways. Within the Nazi hierarchy, corruption and rivalry infected the very system meant to protect the treasure. SS officers siphoned off loot for themselves, hiding gold bars in Swiss banks or selling stolen art on the black market. Some even betrayed convoy routes to the Allies, not out of loyalty, but to settle personal scores or secure safe passage should the Reich fall. The lines between patriotism, greed, and survival blurred until even the most careful Allied planners struggled to know who was working for whom. One of the most infamous betrayals occurred in Italy. In 1944, as the Allies pushed north, partisan groups reported a German convoy carrying crates looted from Florence. The plan was to strike in a mountain pass, but the convoy never arrived. Days later, the partisans discovered their ambush had been betrayed to the Germans. The convoy had taken a different road, and the partisans were encircled. Dozens were executed, their bodies left hanging from trees as a warning to others. For the Allies, every betrayal forced them to adapt. Signals intelligence became more critical than human whispers, yet even intercepted codes could be manipulated. The Germans, aware of Allied listening stations, sometimes transmitted false treasure codes to lure attention away from real movements. It was a game of mirrors within mirrors, where certainty was a luxury no one could afford. But betrayal also revealed something darker. As the Reich weakened, whispers grew of convoys carrying treasure not toward Germany, but away from it, toward secret caches meant to fund a Nazi resurrection after the war. Some informants insisted these shipments were hidden in mountain bunkers. Others swore they were sent across borders, buried in remote valleys, or entrusted to sympathetic regimes. The truth was maddeningly elusive, but one fact was clear: the convoys were no longer simply moving wealth. They were preparing for a future that terrified Allied leaders. Blood stained every lead. Agents died protecting secrets. Partisans vanished into Gestapo prisons. And yet, despite the betrayals, the Allies pressed forward, convinced that the convoys were not untouchable shadows, but threads leading to a final reckoning. That reckoning was approaching. The war was turning, Germany collapsing, and the convoys, laden with the Reich's last illusions of power, were being driven into their final hiding places. But as Allied forces closed in on the mountains, one question remained: could they seize the treasure before it vanished into legend? By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Its armies were broken, its cities reduced to rubble, its leaders retreating into bunkers of despair. Yet amid the ruins, the treasure convoys still moved, ghostly arteries pumping the last veins of stolen wealth into hiding places meant to outlast the war. For the Allies, the race was no longer just about victory on the battlefield. It was about ensuring that the Reich's ill-gotten fortune would not vanish into myth, waiting to fund a new darkness. The chase came to its climax in the Austrian Alps. The region was a fortress of secrecy, riddled with tunnels, salt mines, and mountain passes where entire convoys could vanish from sight. For years, the Nazis had been funneling art, gold, and archives into these strongholds, believing the rugged terrain would protect them from both bombers and advancing armies. The most infamous of these sites was the Alto Sea salt mine, a cavernous labyrinth with chambers vast enough to swallow cathedrals. Within its cold stone walls lay crates upon crates of Europe's stolen soul: Vermeers, Michelangelo's, Da Vinci's, Rembrandt's, even the Ghent altarpiece, carefully wrapped and buried deep underground. As American forces pushed into Austria, intelligence from the OSS and local resistance converged. Convoys were heading not east toward Berlin, but south into the mountains. Trucks carried not ammunition, but sealed crates. Not food, but the last vestiges of the Reich's dream of cultural supremacy. For weeks, Allied reconnaissance watched roads choked with retreating German soldiers, trying to distinguish between the chaos of war's end and the deliberate movements of treasure. One report, delivered by a captured SS officer, chilled the Allied command. Hitler, in his last delirious days, had allegedly ordered that if the Reich could not possess its treasures, no one would. Mines were rigged with explosives. Priceless works of art were to be destroyed rather than fall into Allied hands. For the men tasked with reclaiming Europe's heritage, time had become an executioner. In May 1945, American troops of the 80th Infantry Division stumbled upon one of the most extraordinary discoveries of the war. Hidden in a train near the town of Merkers, they found the Reichsbank's reserves, gold bars, coins, and currency worth hundreds of millions. Alongside it lay bags of jewelry, crates of currency from across occupied Europe, and a chilling cargo: wedding rings, watches, and valuables stripped from the victims of the Holocaust. Each item was a silent witness to a crime too vast to comprehend. But the hunt did not end there. Guided by resistance informants, Allied soldiers advanced into Alto Sea. What they found was staggering. Inside the mine's twisting tunnels lay over 6,500 paintings, thousands of drawings and sculptures, crates of ancient manuscripts, and shelves of rare books. The Nazis had intended this place to be the cornerstone of Hitler's dream museum, the Führer Museum. Instead, it became a tomb of stolen beauty, rescued at the last possible moment. Engineers worked feverishly to disarm the explosives meant to obliterate it all. Had they failed, centuries of human culture would have been lost in a single deafening collapse. Other caches were uncovered across Germany and Austria, castles stacked with crates of plundered wealth, hidden vaults beneath monasteries, and abandoned trucks left to rust in forest clearings. Each discovery was a victory, not just of war, but of memory, proof that history's treasures could be saved, even after the world's darkest storm. Yet not all convoys were found. Some vanished without a trace, feeding legends that persist to this day. Whispers of lost Nazi gold in Bavarian lakes, Trains sealed in Polish tunnels and convoys buried in Alpine valleys continue to haunt treasure hunters and historians alike. Whether these are myths or realities buried beneath time, no one can say with certainty. For the Allies, the final reckoning was bittersweet. They had prevented the wholesale destruction of Europe's cultural soul. They had seized enough gold to cripple the Reich's ability to rise again, yet the moral wounds remained. Each bar of gold carried the fingerprints of victims. Each recovered painting bore the story of a family erased from history. Justice could return the treasures to nations, but it could not return the lives destroyed to steal them. In the aftermath, Allied officers known as the Monuments Men took on the sacred duty of cataloguing and returning the art. They worked in the silence of abandoned mines, dust clinging to their uniforms as they lifted masterpieces back into the light. For them, the task was not just preservation but redemption, an attempt to honor the dead by restoring what had been stolen. Many works were eventually returned, but countless others remained missing, spirited away in the confusion of war or deliberately hidden by those who saw profit in plunder. The Nazi treasure convoys stand today as both legend and warning. They remind us of the fragility of culture in the face of tyranny, and of the price paid when greed and ideology strip humanity of its conscience. They are not merely stories of gold and paintings, but of choices, of those who risked their lives to resist, of those who betrayed for survival, and of those who sought to erase centuries of human achievement for the vanity of a single man. And so, when we speak of the Allies tracking Nazi treasure convoys, we are not only recounting a story of pursuit and recovery. We are confronting a question that still echoes: how much of our past can be stolen, hidden, or destroyed before it changes who we are? The convoys are gone, their engines silent, their wheels long rusted. But their legacy endures, in every museum label marked "Recovered, 1945", in every empty frame that still hangs where a painting was never found, and in every whisper of gold said to lie beneath a mountain lake. History demands we remember, not for treasure, but for truth. And if this story has moved you, if you believe history's shadows deserve light, then join us. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and stand with us as we continue to uncover the forgotten files, the hidden crimes, and the stories the world must never forget.